The year was 2347, and humanity had become something that their ancestors could never have imagined. 300 years of expansion into the stars had transformed them from a species that once feared the dark into one that had conquered it. Admiral George stood on the command bridge of the dreadnought carrier Ironclad and watched the endless black of space through the reinforced viewing panels. He was a tall man with gray hair and sharp eyes that had seen too many battles to count. His uniform carried the weight of 30 years of service, and his presence alone was enough to calm any crew member who felt fear. The Ironclad was not just a ship. It was a fortress that could move through space at speeds that bent the laws of physics. Its hull was layered with armor that could withstand the heat of a dying star. Its weapons could crack moons and shatter fleets. And it was only one of many vessels that humanity had built in preparation for a day that many hoped would never come. Commander Lisa Turner approached the Admiral with a tablet in her hand. She was younger than but carried herself with the same discipline that the military demanded. Her brown hair was tied back, and her expression was serious as she showed him the sensor readings. Something had appeared near the outer edge of the Sol system, something that was not human. Studied the data without speaking. 47 vessels had emerged from what the sensors described as a fold in the fabric of space itself. The ships were unlike anything in the human database. They were curved and smooth like seashells pulled from an ocean on some distant world. Their hulls glowed with soft bioluminescent patterns that shifted and pulsed like living things. They moved together in perfect formation, as if controlled by a single mind. The Admiral gave his first order. The Third Fleet would move to defensive positions around Earth and Mars. All civilian traffic in the outer system would be redirected to safe zones. A priority message would be sent to Earth Command, and the President would be informed immediately. Humanity had trained for this moment for centuries. They would not panic now. On Earth, the news spread quickly through the channels that connected every government and military installation on the planet. President Maria Santos was in a meeting when her chief of staff interrupted with the report. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and a calm demeanor that had guided humanity through two major crises during her time in office. She read the report twice before calling an emergency session with her Joint Chiefs of Staff. The meeting room deep beneath the Capitol building filled with generals and admirals and advisors who had spent their careers preparing for exactly this scenario. Dr. Blake was brought in from the Institute, where she led the xenobiology department. She had spent her life studying the possibility of alien life, and now that possibility had become real. She sat at the table with her hands folded and her mind racing through every theory she had ever developed. The alien fleet made no hostile moves. They simply waited at the edge of the system and broadcast a signal that human communication arrays picked up within minutes. The signal was complex and layered with patterns that suggested language. Teams of linguists and code breakers worked around the clock to decode it while the military held its breath. 72 hours passed. The alien ships did not advance. They did not retreat. They simply existed at the boundary of human space like guests waiting to be invited inside. The tension on every human vessel was thick enough to cut with a knife. Soldiers checked their weapons. Pilots sat in their cockpits ready to launch at a moment's notice. Engineers monitored every system for any sign of sabotage or interference. When the message was finally decoded, it was surprisingly simple. The aliens called themselves the Collective. They had traveled across the galaxy from a region of space that humans had never explored, and they had come to evaluate. The word troubled President Santos more than any threat could have. Evaluate suggested judgment. It suggested that these beings saw themselves as superior and saw humanity as something to be measured and weighed. She had dealt with arrogant leaders before, but never ones who commanded fleets that could appear from nowhere. Admiral received his orders directly from the president. He was to maintain defensive positions, but avoid any action that could be interpreted as aggression. Humanity would meet these visitors, but they would do so from a position of strength. The aliens would see that humans were not primitive creatures to be evaluated like animals in a zoo. The ironclad moved to the front of the defensive formation. Around it gathered cruisers and destroyers and frigates that bristled with weapons capable of devastating entire worlds. Fighter squadrons launched from carrier bays and took up patrol patterns that covered every approach to the inner system. Sensor networks that spanned millions of kilometers activated and began tracking every movement the alien fleet made. Dr. Blake studied the recordings of the alien vessels from her station on Earth. The ships appeared to be grown rather than built. Their organic curves suggested biotechnology far beyond anything humans had achieved. The bioluminescent patterns might be a form of communication, or they might serve some function that humans could not yet understand. She noted that the vessels seemed to lack visible weapons, but she knew better than to assume that meant they were harmless. Commander Turner reported that the alien fleet had begun moving. They were approaching slowly and broadcasting what appeared to be a request for a meeting. They wanted to speak with the leaders of humanity. They wanted to see what kind of species had spread across this small corner of the galaxy. Admiral stood at the viewing panel and watched the distant lights of the alien ships grow brighter as they approached. He thought about all the years of training and all the wars that humanity had fought among themselves. He thought about the weapons they had built and the ships they had designed and the soldiers who stood ready to fight and die for their species. And he thought about the simple truth that had driven humanity since the first human looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there. They had always known this day would come. They had always known that the universe was too vast and too old for humanity to be alone. And they had always known that when they finally met another species, they would need to be ready for anything. The first contact had begun, and humanity would show the exactly what they were made of. The meeting point was chosen carefully. It sat in the empty space between the alien fleet and the human defensive perimeter, where neither side held an advantage. Admiral George would lead the diplomatic mission himself. President Santos had insisted that humanity send its best and was the finest military mind they had. Ambassador Moore would handle the actual negotiations. He was a patient man with decades of experience in difficult talks and a talent for reading people even when those people were not human at all. Sergeant Cole led the security detail. He was built like a wall with broad shoulders and hands that had seen combat on a dozen worlds. His team of 12 soldiers were the best the military had to offer. Each one had been trained to fight in every environment imaginable, and each one carried weapons that could punch through starship armor. The humans arrived in 3 vessels. The lead ship was the stealth destroyer Silent Thunder. It was angular and dark and covered in panels that absorbed light and sensor waves alike. The ship could vanish from detection systems entirely and reappear wherever its captain wished. Flanking it were 2 heavy cruisers armed with enough firepower to level a small moon. What they did not know was that 18 additional warships waited in the shadow of a nearby asteroid field. They ran cold with their systems powered down and their hulls masked by the rocks around them. If anything went wrong, they would be ready. The delegation arrived in a vessel that seemed to glow from within. It was larger than the human ships and moved with a grace that suggested it was more alive than machine. The ship settled into position and extended what appeared to be a docking bridge made of crystalline material that sparkled like frozen starlight. Admiral led his team across the bridge and into the alien vessel. The interior was unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls pulsed with soft light, and the floor seemed to shift slightly beneath his boots, as if the ship itself was breathing. The air was clean and carried a faint scent like flowers after rain. Everything about the vessel spoke of a civilization that had mastered biology and technology and merged them into something beautiful. The delegation waited in a chamber at the heart of the ship. Their leader stood at the center of the room. High Observer Ani was 8 feet tall with silver-blue skin that shimmered under the ambient light. He had 4 slender arms that moved with fluid grace and eyes that were large and dark, and filled with an intelligence that was clearly ancient. His robes flowed around him like water, and symbols that might have been writing or might have been decoration covered every surface of the fabric. Ani spoke in a language that sounded like music. A device around his neck translated his words into English with only a slight delay. He welcomed the humans to his vessel and expressed curiosity about their species. His tone carried something that recognized immediately. It was condescension. The alien looked at them the way a teacher might look at a child who had wandered into a lecture meant for adults. Ambassador Moore stepped forward and delivered the formal greetings that protocol demanded. He spoke of humanity's desire for peace and cooperation. He spoke of the hope that this meeting would be the beginning of a long friendship between their peoples. His words were diplomatic and measured and gave nothing away. Ani listened with what might have been patience or might have been amusement. When the ambassador finished, the High Observer spoke again. He explained that they had been watching humanity for nearly 2 centuries. They had detected the first radio signals that humans had sent into space, and they had tracked the progress of the species ever since. They had expected to find primitives when they finally arrived. They had expected creatures still burning hydrocarbons and fighting over patches of dirt on a single planet. Instead, they found a species that traveled between stars. This was unexpected. The alien gestured toward the viewing panel that showed the human vessels waiting outside. He noted that the ships were crude and blocky and lacked the elegance that they valued. He explained that vessels were grown from living crystal and powered by contained singularities. He asked what humanity could possibly offer a civilization that had existed for 300,000 years. Had heard enough. He stepped forward and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of authority. He suggested that a demonstration might be more effective than words. The alien tilted his head in what might have been curiosity and agreed. The Admiral activated his communicator and gave a single command to the Silent Thunder. The response was immediate. Outside the viewing panel, the stealth destroyer seemed to fold in on itself like a piece of paper being crumpled. One moment it was there. The next moment it was gone. The sensors went wild. Officers on the alien ship scrambled to locate the vanished vessel but found nothing. It was as if the Silent Thunder had ceased to exist entirely. Then, without warning, the destroyer reappeared. It materialized directly behind the flagship, so close that its hull nearly touched the crystalline surface of the alien vessel. It had crossed the distance between positions instantly and without any detectable transition. One moment it was gone. The next moment it was close enough to deliver a killing blow. Ani stood very still. His forearms trembled slightly, and his dark eyes fixed on the human ship that now hovered behind his flagship. For the first time since the meeting began, the condescension was gone from his expression. In its place was something that might have been surprise or might have been fear. Watched the alien carefully. He did not smile and he did not gloat. He simply stood with his hands clasped behind his back and let the demonstration speak for itself. They had expected primitives. They had expected creatures that would be impressed by their ancient civilization and their elegant technology. Instead, they had found something else entirely. Ambassador Moore broke the silence with a calm observation. He noted that humanity had developed many interesting capabilities during their time among the stars. He suggested that further demonstrations could be arranged if the High Observer was interested in learning more. Ani was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke in a voice that had lost much of its earlier music. He said that further demonstrations would be most welcome. He said that the collective would like to understand exactly what humanity was capable of. And beneath his words was a question that he did not ask aloud. A question that could see in those ancient dark eyes. What exactly had they stumbled upon at the edge of this small, unremarkable star system? And had they made a terrible mistake by coming here at all? The demonstration with the Silent Thunder had shaken but it had not convinced them entirely. High Observer Ani recovered his composure quickly and proposed a series of trials to properly evaluate human capabilities. He claimed it was standard protocol for any species seeking to join the galactic community. His tone suggested that he still believed the stealth maneuver had been a trick, or perhaps the only impressive thing humanity could do. Admiral accepted the challenge without hesitation. The trials would take place over the next 3 days in a region of space far from any inhabited worlds. Both fleets relocated to the testing ground and took up positions on opposite sides of a field of asteroids that would serve as targets and obstacles. Engineers and officers from both civilizations worked to establish the rules and parameters. They were meticulous about fairness. They wanted no excuses when they proved their superiority. The first trial was speed, a race between the fastest vessels each civilization could offer. The selected one of their scout ships. It was sleek and beautiful with a hull that seemed to flow like liquid metal. The ship was capable of bending space around itself to reduce the distance between 2 points. It could cross light years in moments and had never been outpaced by any vessel in recorded history. Lieutenant Commander was chosen to pilot the human entry. He was young for his rank with dark hair and a calm confidence that came from knowing exactly what he and his ship could do. His vessel was the Razor One. It looked nothing like the elegant Scout. It was angular and sharp like a blade forged from black metal. Every line of its design spoke of speed and aggression and a complete disregard for beauty. The course was set. Both ships would travel from the starting point to a marker beacon placed 3 light minutes away. They were confident. Their scout had made similar runs thousands of times. The race began with a signal from a neutral observer drone. The scout accelerated smoothly and gracefully. Space bent around it as the ship pushed itself forward through the folded fabric of reality. It moved faster than light itself and left a trail of distorted starlight in its wake. The pilot was experienced and pushed the vessel to its maximum capability. He expected to arrive at the beacon and wait for the primitive human ship to catch up. Pushed the throttle forward and engaged the quantum slip drive. The Razor One did not bend space. It did not accelerate in any traditional sense. Instead, it simply ceased to exist in one location and existed in another. There was no transition. There was no travel. One moment the ship was at the starting point. The next moment it was at the beacon. The scout arrived 4 minutes later. The pilot stared at the human vessel already waiting at the marker. He ran diagnostic checks on his sensors and confirmed what he was seeing. The human had arrived before him. It should have been impossible. Ani observed the results from his flagship without comment. His expression was unreadable, but his 4 arms had stopped their graceful movements entirely. The second trial was firepower, a test of destructive capability against a series of asteroids selected for their size and composition. The went first. One of their cruisers positioned itself before a massive rock nearly 2 kilometers in diameter. The ship charged its primary weapon, and the space around it began to glow with accumulated energy. Then it fired. The plasma lance was a beam of concentrated stellar matter held together by magnetic fields that they had perfected over. It struck the asteroid and vaporized nearly half of the rock in an instant. The remaining fragments glowed white-hot and spun away into the void. It was an impressive display, the kind of firepower that could devastate fleets and crack the crusts of planets. The human cruiser Hammer of Dawn took its position before a similar asteroid. Captain Wells stood on the bridge with her arms crossed and her eyes fixed on the target. She was a woman who had commanded warships for 20 years and had never lost a battle. She gave the order to fire in a voice that carried no emotion at all. The activated. It was a simple weapon in concept, a series of magnetic accelerators that propelled a solid tungsten rod down a barrel nearly a kilometer long. The rod was accelerated to 12% of the speed of light before it left the ship. There was no flash of light. There was no visible beam. The projectile moved too fast for eyes or sensors to track. The asteroid ceased to exist. It did not explode. It did not shatter. The kinetic energy of the impact reduced the entire rock to subatomic particles that scattered into the void as a cloud of radiation. Where a 2-kilometer asteroid had floated moments before, there was now nothing but empty space and fatting heat. Ani stood frozen at the viewing panel. Around him, his officers whispered to each other in voices that carried notes of fear. The third trial was defense. They would fire upon a human vessel with their full weapons array. A corvette called the Iron Veil was selected to receive the attack. It was a small ship by human standards, barely 200 meters long with a crew of only 40. It positioned itself in the target zone and waited. They opened fire with everything they had: plasma lances and particle beams and missiles that carried warheads powerful enough to crack continents. The barrage was overwhelming. It was the kind of attack that should have reduced any vessel to molten slag within seconds. Iron Veil did not move. Its shields activated and surrounded the ship with a sphere of shimmering energy. The weapon struck the barrier and something unexpected happened. The shields did not just absorb the energy, they converted it. The power of the attack was captured and redirected and channeled back toward the source. A pulse of energy erupted from the corvette and washed over the vessels. Every weapon system on the attacking ships went dead. Their targeting arrays failed. Their power cores fluctuated. They were disabled, without a single shot being fired in return. Captain Wells allowed herself a small smile as she watched the results on her display. Ani finally spoke. His voice was quiet, and the music that had colored his earlier words was gone entirely. He requested an end to the trials. He said that he had seen enough. He asked if Admiral would consent to a private meeting to discuss what he had witnessed. Agreed. He walked through the corridors of the ironclad toward the meeting chamber with a calm that he did not entirely feel. The trials had gone exactly as he had expected. Humanity had spent centuries preparing for war against unknown enemies. They had built weapons and ships and defenses that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Now the galaxy would learn what that preparation had created. The question was what the galaxy would do with that knowledge. The meeting chamber was small and quiet. It sat at the heart of a neutral station that both sides had agreed upon for privacy. The walls were transparent and showed the endless field of stars that surrounded them on all sides. Admiral George sat in a simple chair across from High Observer Ani. There were no guards and no weapons allowed. Just two beings from different worlds trying to understand each other. Ani looked different than he had during the trials. The confidence that had radiated from him during their first meeting was gone. His 4 arms rested in his lap, and his dark eyes studied the human before him with something that looked almost like desperation. He had questions, and he needed answers. The alien spoke first. His translator device rendered his musical language into flat English words, but the emotion behind them was clear. He asked how any of this was possible. He explained that the collective had existed for 300,000 years. They had watched stars be born and die. They had conquered physics and bent the universe to their will. They had encountered hundreds of other species across the galaxy, and none of them had ever demonstrated anything close to what humanity had shown in those 3 days. Listened without interruption. He understood what the alien was feeling. They had arrived expecting to find primitives. They had come to evaluate a species that should have been centuries behind them in development. Instead, they had found something that terrified them, and now they needed to know why. The Admiral leaned forward and asked if the High Observer truly wanted the truth. Ani said that he did, nodded slowly and began to explain. Humanity had been at war with itself since the very beginning. Since the first human had picked up a rock and used it to strike another. There had never been a generation in human history that had not known conflict. War was woven into the fabric of human civilization like threads in a tapestry. It shaped their cultures and their technologies and their very way of thinking. Every advancement they made was filtered through a single question. Could this help them win the next war? Pulled up a holographic display that filled the space between them. It showed a timeline of human history. The images scrolled past in an endless stream of violence. Spears and swords gave way to guns and cannons. Guns gave way to bombs that could flatten cities. Bombs gave way to weapons that could crack the crust of a planet and render it lifeless. Each generation had found new and more efficient ways to destroy their enemies. Each war had pushed human technology forward at a pace that should have been impossible. Ani watched the display with growing horror. His species had known conflict in their distant past, but they had moved beyond it hundreds of thousands of years ago. The idea of a species that had never stopped fighting was almost incomprehensible to him. Continued. For 3 centuries, humanity had believed they were alone in the universe. They had spread across the stars and colonized dozens of worlds, but they had never found another intelligent species. And so they had prepared for the worst. They had assumed that anything they met in the darkness between stars would want to destroy them, just as they had tried to destroy each other so many times before. Every scientific breakthrough was examined for military applications. Every discovery was weaponized. Every ship they built was designed to fight. Every soldier they trained was taught to kill without hesitation. They had created a civilization that was built around a single purpose: survival at any cost. The admiral turned off the display and looked directly at the alien. He explained that humans were not proud of their history. The wars they had fought against each other were a source of deep shame. Millions had died in conflicts that seemed pointless in hindsight. Entire civilizations had been wiped out by their own kind. But that shame had also driven them forward. They had sworn that they would never be victims again. Not to disease, not to famine, not to each other. And certainly not to anything they might encounter among the stars. Ani was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He asked if humanity had built all of this out of fear. Shook his head slowly. Fear was part of it, but not all of it. Humanity was also driven by stubbornness, by a refusal to accept defeat no matter the odds, by a belief that they could overcome any challenge if they fought hard enough and sacrificed enough. They were a species that had looked at impossible situations and decided to try anyway. Sometimes they failed, but often they succeeded, and each success made them stronger. The alien asked another question. He wanted to know if humans were a threat to the collective, if all this military power would be turned against his people. Considered the question carefully before answering. He explained that humanity did not want war with the. They had built their weapons to defend themselves, not to conquer others. But he was honest about the reality of human nature. If they attacked them or tried to destroy them, then humanity would fight back with everything they had. They would not surrender. They would not negotiate from weakness. They would fight until they won or until every last human was dead. But if the wanted peace, then humanity would welcome it. They would share their knowledge and learn from the collective in return. They would work together to explore the galaxy and face whatever challenges awaited them. Humans were capable of great destruction, but they were also capable of great cooperation when they chose to be. Ani sat in silence as he absorbed everything he had heard. The human before him was unlike anything he had expected. There was no arrogance in his words, no boasting about human superiority. There was only honesty about what humanity was and what they had become. The alien rose from his seat and moved to the transparent wall. He looked out at the stars for a long moment before speaking again. He said that he had traveled across the galaxy believing that they were the greatest civilization that had ever existed. He had looked down on other species as primitives who could never hope to match what his people had achieved. Now he understood that he had been wrong. Humanity had achieved in 3 centuries what they had not managed in 300,000 years. They had created weapons and ships and tactics that the collective could not match. And they had done it not because they were inherently superior, but because they had faced constant pressure that forced them to evolve or die. He turned back to face the admiral and made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. He said that they would not challenge humanity. They would not try to contain them or control them, Instead, they would approach them as equals. It was the only choice that made sense. Stood and extended his hand in the human gesture of agreement. Ani studied the gesture for a moment, then reached out with one of his four arms and clasped the human's hand in his own. The first true step toward peace had been taken. The news traveled across the galaxy faster than any ship could fly. The collective had encountered a new species at the edge of known space. They had come expecting to find primitives, and instead they had found something that had shaken the foundations of everything they believed about the universe. The details of the trials spread from system to system and world to world, until every spacefaring civilization had heard the stories. High Observer Ani returned to thee and stood before the High Council to deliver his report. The chamber was vast and ancient, and filled with beings who had guided their civilization for thousands of years. They listened in silence as Ani described everything he had witnessed. The stealth ship that could vanish and reappear at will. The weapon that reduced asteroids to nothing but scattered atoms. The shields that turned enemy fire into a weapon against the attackers. And the truth about how humanity had developed such terrifying capabilities. The council deliberated for 7 days. Some argued that humanity was too dangerous to be allowed to grow. They suggested that the collective should gather their fleets and strike now while they still might have a chance. Others pointed out that such an attack would almost certainly fail and would turn a potential ally into a certain enemy. In the end, wisdom prevailed over fear. The High Council issued a formal declaration that was broadcast across every communication network in the galaxy. It stated that the species called humanity had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded any reasonable expectation for a civilization of their age. It warned that humanity was not to be engaged in conflict under any circumstances. It declared that humans were to be treated as equals in all matters of diplomacy and trade. And it invited humanity to send representatives to the Galactic Council to take their place among the stars. On Earth, the reaction was a mixture of pride and relief. President Maria Santos addressed the United Nations General Assembly in a speech that would be remembered for generations. She spoke of the long journey that had brought humanity to this moment, the centuries of struggle and sacrifice, the wars that had nearly destroyed them, and the determination that had saved them. She acknowledged that humanity had built its power on a foundation of conflict, but she also spoke of the hope that this new chapter in their history would be different. Ambassador Moore was chosen to represent humanity at the Galactic Council. He prepared for the journey with the same careful attention to detail that had served him throughout his career. Dr. Blake would accompany him as a scientific advisor, and Admiral George would lead the military escort that would ensure their safe arrival. The three of them had become something like a team during the first contact, and it seemed fitting that they would take this next step together. The journey to the Council took 3 weeks even with the advanced drives that human ships possessed. The world they arrived at was called Nexus Prime, and it served as the seat of galactic governance. It was a massive artificial construct that orbited a stable star at the heart of the galaxy. Thousands of species had contributed to its construction over millions of years. It was meant to represent the unity and cooperation of civilized beings throughout the cosmos. When the human delegation entered the council chamber for the first time, they found themselves surrounded by representatives of over 200 spacefaring species. Some were humanoid in shape, while others were so alien that human eyes struggled to comprehend them. There were beings made of living crystal and creatures that floated in tanks of exotic gases. There were hive minds that spoke through multiple bodies and ancient intelligences that had transcended physical form entirely. They all turned to look at the three humans who walked down the central aisle, toward the platform reserved for new members. Ambassador Moore could feel the weight of their attention. Some looked at the humans with fear in whatever passed for their eyes. Others showed curiosity or caution or something that might have been admiration. A few displayed open hostility, though they kept their distance. The stories of the trials had spread far and wide. Every being in that chamber knew what humanity was capable of. Moore took his place at the speaking platform and delivered the speech he had prepared. He spoke of humanity's desire for peace and cooperation. He acknowledged the violent history that had shaped his species, but emphasized that humans had always been capable of choosing a better path. He invited the assembled civilizations to work together with humanity to face the challenges that awaited them all. When he finished speaking, the chamber was silent for a long moment. Then Ani rose from his seat in the delegation and walked to the center of the floor. He faced the assembled council and spoke in support of the human application for membership. He described what he had seen during the trials and what he had learned in his private conversation with Admiral. He said that humanity had earned their place among the stars not through conquest, but through sheer determination to survive. The vote was held immediately. The result was nearly unanimous. Humanity was accepted into the Galactic Council as a full member with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. The decision would reshape the balance of power across the galaxy for centuries to come. In the months that followed, humanity established embassies on dozens of worlds. Trade agreements were negotiated. Scientific exchanges began. Soldiers who had trained their entire lives for war found themselves serving as peacekeepers and diplomats instead. Sergeant Cole led the first joint human security force. Lieutenant Commander continued to fly and became known across the galaxy as the fastest pilot alive. Admiral retired 1 year after the first contact. He returned to Earth and took a position teaching at the Naval Academy, where young officers trained for careers that would now include diplomacy as well as combat. He told his students about the day humanity proved itself to the stars. He taught them that strength was not just about weapons and ships. It was also about knowing when not to use them. Dr. Blake continued her research and eventually established the first research institute on Nexus Prime. She worked alongside scientists from 100 different worlds to unlock the secrets of the universe. The institute became a symbol of what civilizations could achieve when they chose cooperation over conflict. And somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, other civilizations heard the news of what had happened. Species that had hidden from the great powers of the galaxy. Civilizations that had given up hope of ever being treated as equals. They heard that a young species from a small world at the edge of known space had walked into the halls of power and demanded to be recognized. They heard that humanity had arrived. Some of them began to wonder if perhaps they too could find their place among the stars, if perhaps the galaxy was not as rigid and unchanging as they had believed, if perhaps there was hope for beings who refused to surrender no matter the odds. President Santos gave one final speech before the end of her term. She stood before the people of Earth and spoke words that would be carved into monuments and remembered for generations. She said that humanity had spent so long preparing for war that they had forgotten to hope for peace, but peace had found them anyway. Now they had a choice. They could hold on to the fear and suspicion that had driven them for so long, or they could embrace this new future and prove that they deserved it. She chose hope, and she asked humanity to choose it with her. Across the planet and across the colonies that stretched through 100 star systems, people listened to her words. They thought about all the battles their ancestors had fought and all the sacrifices that had been made. They thought about the weapons they had built and the enemies they had overcome, and they thought about the future that now stretched before them. A future where humanity was no longer alone. A future where they could finally stop preparing for war and start building something better. The galaxy had learned what humanity was capable of when pushed to the edge. Now it would learn what they were capable of when given a chance to thrive. And that would be the greatest demonstration of all.